The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was filled with representatives from dozens of species, each seated in their designated sections. The air buzzed with quiet conversations as diplomats prepared for the upcoming negotiations. In the center of it all, under the bright lights, sat the Zirek Empire's ambassador, a towering creature with dark red scales and piercing yellow eyes. His name was Voktal, and he was known for his ruthless nature and deep hatred for humanity. Ella Carter walked into the hall, her steps calm and measured. She was dressed in a formal Earth diplomat's uniform, a simple yet elegant outfit that contrasted sharply with the ornate and imposing attire of the alien dignitaries around her. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes scanning the room with quiet confidence. She moved to her assigned seat, her presence barely acknowledged by most of the aliens present. A low murmur spread through the hall as some species noticed the human diplomat's arrival. Most of them dismissed her instantly. Humanity was still a relatively new player on the galactic stage, and many powerful empires saw them as weak. The Zirek, in particular, had no respect for humans. To them, humans were nothing more than an insignificant race, barely worth mentioning. And this woman, she was just a diplomat, a weak, fragile creature who had no place among true leaders. Voktal smirked as he looked at Ella. He leaned back in his seat and let out a deep chuckle, loud enough for those nearby to hear. So this is humanity's representative, a small, delicate thing sent to negotiate on behalf of her pathetic species. His voice was dripping with amusement, and several nearby diplomats chuckled. Ella did not react. She simply met his gaze with calm, steady eyes. That lack of fear made Voktal's amusement fade just a little, but he pushed the thought aside. The meeting began. Various empires discussed trade routes, border conflicts, and territorial claims. When it was finally humanity's turn to speak, Ella stood up. Her voice was clear, steady, and filled with authority. The human delegation is here to ensure fair negotiations for the upcoming territorial agreements. We expect all parties to act with respect and diplomacy. Voktal laughed loudly, interrupting her. Respect. Diplomacy. He leaned forward, his sharp teeth visible as he grinned. You misunderstand where you are, human. This is not a place where the weak make demands. This is where the strong take what they want. Ella didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly, watching him as if he was nothing more than a child throwing a tantrum. The silence in the room stretched as many diplomats waited for her response. But instead of engaging in the argument, she simply gave a small smile and sat back down. The lack of reaction confused Voktal, but he quickly moved on, turning his attention back to the other discussions. After the meeting, several diplomats gathered in private groups, whispering amongst themselves. Some found Ella's behavior strange. Others found it amusing. But there was one group of aliens who looked concerned. They knew something the others didn't. A Nervac delegate, a tall insectoid creature with large black eyes, turned to a Corthan officer beside him and whispered, "Do they even know who she is married to?" The Corthan officer froze. His normally pale green skin turned an even lighter shade as he looked at Ella again. His eyes widened in realization, and his breath caught in his throat. "They have no idea," the officer muttered under his breath. The Nervac nodded. "This is going to end badly for the Zirek." Meanwhile, Voktal was still in a good mood. He had successfully humiliated the human diplomat in front of the entire council. In his mind, humanity had been put in its place. He saw no need to think about them any further. But as he left the hall, his personal advisor rushed to his side, holding a datapad with shaking hands. "Ambassador, we need to talk." Voktal glanced at him, annoyed. "What is it now?" The advisor hesitated. "It's about Ella Carter." "There is information you need to see." Voktal rolled his eyes. "What nonsense are you panicking about? She's just another human, insignificant, weak." The advisor gulped. "No, sir, she's not just another human. She's..." He hesitated before leaning closer and whispering something in Vogtel's ear. The moment the words left his mouth, Vogtel's entire body stiffened. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure disbelief. He snatched the data pad from his advisor's hands and stared at the screen. His eyes darted back and forth as he read the information, his claws tightening around the device. "No, this can't be right," he whispered. His advisor swallowed hard. "It is. And sir, if what we know about him is true, then we might be in danger." Vogtel's mind raced. He had made a terrible mistake. He had insulted a woman who was not only a diplomat, but the wife of John Carter. The name alone sent a chill through his spine. A name spoken in hushed whispers across the galaxy. A name that carried a history of war, destruction, and victories so absolute that even the most powerful empires feared it. And now, that man would know what Vogtel had done. Ella Carter walked out of the hall, her calm smile still on her face. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The Zirac thought she was weak, but they had no idea what storm was coming their way. Vogtel sat in his private chamber, his claws tapping nervously against the armrest of his chair. The room was dimly lit, the glow from his datapad casting eerie shadows across his face. His eyes remained locked on the screen, reading the name over and over again. John Carter. That name wasn't just a name. It was a warning. A nightmare spoken in hushed whispers across battlefields and war rooms. There were entire military strategies based on avoiding him. Entire fleets that had fallen because they underestimated him. And now, Vogtel had insulted his wife. His advisor stood nearby, shifting uncomfortably. "Sir, what should we do?" he asked cautiously. Vogtel didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing. This was not how things were supposed to go. He had mocked the human diplomat, laughed at her in front of the entire council. If he had known, if anyone had known, he would have never dared. His claws clenched into a fist. "Does anyone else know?" The advisor hesitated before nodding. "The information is spreading. Some of the other diplomats have already figured it out. It's only a matter of time before." A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. A Zirac officer stepped inside, looking uneasy. "Ambassador, we have received a transmission." Vogtel's stomach tightened. "From who?" The officer hesitated, then spoke two words that made the room feel colder. "John Carter." A silence fell over the chamber. Vogtel's throat felt dry. Slowly, he gestured for the officer to play the message. The screen on the wall flickered to life. At first, there was only static. Then, the image cleared, revealing a man sitting in a dark room, his face partially hidden by shadows. His presence alone was enough to send a chill down Vogtel's spine. John Carter. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and calculating. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. Too calm. "I heard what happened," Carter said simply. "I heard what was said to my wife." Vogtel's claws tightened around the armrest, his tail twitching with nervous energy. Carter leaned forward slightly, his voice still steady. "I'll give you one chance to make this right. One." His eyes darkened. "Because if you don't, you know what happens next." The message ended. The screen went black. Vogtel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His mind screamed at him to do something, to fix this before it was too late. The advisor spoke carefully. "Sir, we need to respond. Immediately." But before Vogtel could answer, another officer rushed into the room, looking pale. "Ambassador, we have an urgent report. Human warships have been spotted mobilizing near Zirac-controlled space." Panic rippled through the chamber. It was happening. The Zirac Empire had made a mistake, and John Carter was coming. The Zirac Empire's high command was in chaos. Messages flooded in from border patrols, each one reporting the same terrifying news. Human warships were moving. Not one or two, but an entire fleet. Vogtel stood in the war room, surrounded by high-ranking Zirac officers. The massive holographic display in the center of the room showed a map of their territory. Red dots, marking human ships, had begun appearing along their borders. More were arriving by the hour. Vogtel's tail flicked anxiously. "Have they sent a declaration of war?" he demanded. One of his officers shook his head. "No official declaration, Ambassador, but their movements are aggressive." Vogtel's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Humanity was supposed to be weak, insignificant. They were supposed to beg for peace, not march their warships straight to the Zirek border. His advisor, standing close by, spoke in a low voice. "Sir, this is his doing. John Carter." Vogtel's jaw tightened. He already knew this wasn't just a show of force from humanity. This was personal. Another officer spoke up, his voice tense. "Sir, we need to respond. If we appear weak, the other empires will see this as an opportunity to strike." Vogtel clenched his fists. He had spent years building his reputation as a ruthless, unshakable leader. He couldn't afford to look weak now. But facing John Carter, that was a different kind of battle. One of the younger officers scoffed. "They are just human ships. We should fire a warning shot. Show them that they can't intimidate us." The room fell silent. The older officers exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the advisor sighed. "You fool. You don't understand what we're dealing with." The young officer frowned. "They are just humans." The advisor turned, eyes cold. "Do you know what happened at the Battle of Terra 5? The officer hesitated. "That was the battle where the humans defeated the Korthan Empire's invasion force." "No." The advisor's voice was sharp. "It was the battle where John Carter led a fleet that was outnumbered 5-1, and still annihilated the Korthan forces. The Korthan Empire has never fully recovered from that defeat." The young officer paled. Another officer spoke. "Or the siege of Vexus Prime, where Carter's forces broke through a planetary blockade in under 12 hours. And let's not forget," another added grimly, "the fall of Drasvan." A heavy silence fell over the room. The fall of Drasvan. A brutal battle where an entire empire had thought they could challenge humanity. They had learned the hard way. Their fleets had been torn apart, their leaders executed, and at the center of it all was John Carter. Vogtel took a deep breath. He had to fix this before it reached that point. "Send a message to the human fleet," he ordered. "Request an immediate diplomatic meeting." The officer in charge of communications hesitated. "Who should we address the message to?" Vogtel's throat felt dry as he spoke the name. "John Carter." The room remained tense as the message was sent. Minutes passed. Then the reply came. The officer read it aloud. "Message received. John Carter has agreed to meet." Vogtel exhaled in relief. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out of this. But as the officer continued reading, Vogtel's blood ran cold. "He's coming in person." Vogtel sat in the grand diplomatic hall, his claws tapping anxiously against the polished surface of the table. The massive chamber, usually a place of political games and careful negotiations, felt like a cage today. Every Zirek official present could feel it. The air was thick with unease. John Carter was coming. In person. A human diplomat would have been bad enough. But Carter wasn't just a diplomat. He was a warrior, a strategist, a man whose name sent shivers down the spines of military leaders across the galaxy. And Vogtel had insulted his wife. The doors at the far end of the chamber slid open. Two heavily armed human guards stepped inside, their faces expressionless behind their helmets. They scanned the room with sharp, practiced movements before stepping aside. And then he entered. John Carter walked in with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove. He didn't wear a uniform, but he didn't need to. Every Zirek in the room recognized the way he moved, like a soldier, like a predator who had walked through war and come out stronger. He stopped at the table, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Vogtel's. The Zirek ambassador swallowed hard. For a moment, there was silence. A heavy, Suffocating silence. Then Carter spoke. His voice was calm, steady, too steady. "Do you have anything to say to me?" Voktal forced himself to sit straighter. He couldn't show weakness, not in front of his own people. He took a breath and spoke carefully. "This was a misunderstanding." Carter didn't blink. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Voktal felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. He glanced at his advisor, who remained frozen, unwilling to interfere. "I did not know who she was," Voktal admitted. Carter tilted his head slightly. "And if you had known?" Voktal hesitated. The truth was, if he had known, he never would have dared to insult her. But saying that out loud would only make things worse. "I regret my words," he said instead. "They were poorly chosen." Carter exhaled slowly, leaning forward just enough to make the tension rise. "Poorly chosen," he echoed. "Tell me, Ambassador, do you know how many soldiers have died because they poorly chose their enemies?" Voktal's claws dug into his chair. Carter continued, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that made every word feel heavier. "Your empire looks down on humans. You think we're weak, soft." His eyes narrowed. "But I think you've started to learn the truth." Voktal struggled to maintain his composure. "We are willing to." Carter cut him off. "Here's what's going to happen." The room stiffened. Zirek leaders weren't used to being spoken to this way, but none of them dared to interrupt. Carter placed both hands on the table. "You're going to issue a formal apology to my wife. Publicly." His voice remained steady, but there was an unspoken warning beneath it. "And then, you're going to change the way your empire treats human diplomats. Because if something like this happens again..." He leaned in, his voice dropping just slightly. "I won't come here to talk." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Voktal swallowed hard. He looked at the other Zirek officials, searching for support. None of them met his gaze. They had all seen the human warships. They had all heard the stories. And they all knew that John Carter wasn't bluffing. Slowly, Voktal nodded. "The apology will be issued." Carter held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small, satisfied nod. He straightened, turning to leave. The two human guards immediately moved to follow. Just as he reached the door, Carter paused. Without turning back, he spoke one last time. "Oh, and Ambassador." Voktal stiffened. "Yes?" Carter glanced over his shoulder. His expression was unreadable. "Next time, do your research." Then he was gone. "You said..." Voktal sat alone in his chamber, staring at the blank screen in front of him. His claws tapped against the table, his tail flicking anxiously behind him. The words he needed to say were simple, but forcing them out felt like swallowing poison. A public apology. To a human. No, to John Carter's wife. The humiliation burned inside him, but the choice was clear. Carter had left no room for negotiation. The human fleet was still stationed near Zirek-controlled space, their warships unmoving but ever-present. One wrong move, and this would become more than a diplomatic disaster. It would become a war. And it would be a war the Zirek would not win. Taking a deep breath, Voktal activated the recording device. His reflection appeared on the screen, a proud Zirek official who had spent years commanding respect. Now his voice would be broadcasted across the empire, delivering an apology that would stain his reputation forever. He forced himself to speak. To the human diplomatic corps and to Ambassador Lillian Carter, even saying her name felt bitter. "I regret my actions during our recent negotiations. My words were spoken without knowledge of their full impact, and for that, I apologize." He paused. His claws clenched under the table, but he kept his expression neutral. "Show no weakness. I acknowledge that my comments were disrespectful, and I assure you that steps will be taken to ensure such misunderstandings do not happen again." It was as much as he could give, more than he wanted to. Ending the transmission, he exhaled sharply, feeling as though he had just surrendered a battle without ever stepping onto the battlefield. The apology was sent out. It spread fast, playing across every major Zirac news network. His name, once a symbol of power, was now being whispered with ridicule by political rivals. But it wasn't just the Zirac watching. The humans had received the message. And now, they would decide what happened next. Hours later, in the depths of space, aboard the HSS Valiant, a transmission arrived. John Carter stood in the command center of his warship, watching the screen as Vochtel's apology played. His expression remained unreadable. Around him, his officers waited in silence. When the message ended, Carter exhaled slowly. "Commander," one of his officers asked, "does this mean we're standing down?" Carter didn't answer immediately. He stared at the stars beyond the viewport, his mind weighing every possibility. The Zirac had learned their lesson. For now. Finally, he turned to his communications officer. "Send a response. Acknowledge the apology." He paused. "And tell them this. We'll be watching." The officer nodded, sending the message. Carter glanced at the holographic map of the Zirac Empire. His fleet remained in position, their weapons powered down but still there. A reminder. A warning. The Zirac thought this was over. But John Carter knew better. They wouldn't forget this lesson anytime soon. And if they did, he would be back. Vochtel sat in silence, watching the response from the humans come through. It was brief. Too brief. Acknowledged. We'll be watching. That was it. No further threats. No demands. But somehow that short message was more terrifying than an open declaration of war. The Zirac High Command had gathered in a private chamber, watching the message over and over again. No one spoke. No one needed to. The meaning was clear. The humans weren't done with them. Vochtel turned to his advisors. "This is an opportunity," he said carefully. "We must ensure this situation does not repeat itself." One of the military officials scoffed. "So we bend to them now. The mighty Zirac Empire submits to humans." Vochtel narrowed his eyes. The mighty Zirac Empire nearly got itself annihilated because of arrogance. He let his words hang in the air. "We underestimated humanity. That was our mistake. We will not make it again." The chamber fell into a tense silence. Then one of the older generals spoke, his voice thoughtful. "What do you propose?" Vochtel exhaled slowly. "We need to understand them. Study their culture, their military, their tactics." His tail twitched. "We thought we knew what humans were, but we were wrong." Another official frowned. "And how do you propose we do that? Their government won't simply hand over classified information." Vochtel leaned forward. "We don't need their classified data. We need access. We need people on the inside. Spies, informants, analysts. We need to know what makes them so dangerous." The room murmured in agreement. The Zirac were no strangers to espionage, but never before had they considered needing it for humans. A younger officer hesitated. Wouldn't it be easier to simply avoid conflict? Vochtel let out a low chuckle. "Do you think Carter trusts us now? Do you think he believes we've changed?" He shook his head. "No, he's watching us, waiting. And if we make the wrong move, he will come back." His gaze hardened. "Next time, we need to be ready." The officials exchanged uneasy glances. None of them liked this. None of them wanted to admit it. But they all knew Vochtel was right. For the first time in Zirac history, their empire would have to fear humans. On board the HSS Valiant, John Carter stood at the observation deck, staring at the swirling lights of hyperspace. His expression was unreadable. Lillian Carter approached him, standing by his side. "They won't forget this," she said softly. "No," John agreed, "but they'll try something." She nodded. "Spies? Maybe. Or something worse." He exhaled, his jaw tightening. "This isn't over." "Not really." Lillian placed a hand on his. "So what do we do?" John Carter turned to her, a small smirk on his lips. Simple. His blue eyes gleamed with determination. We let them think they're watching us. Meanwhile, we watch them. Deep within the Xeric Empire, in a heavily guarded intelligence facility, Voktal stood before a massive holographic display. The image floating before him was unmistakable. John Carter, the man who had shaken their empire with nothing more than his presence. Surrounding his image were streams of data, reports, intercepted transmissions, and carefully gathered intelligence. The Xeric had mobilized their best spies, their most skilled analysts. They had dedicated resources to one single purpose: understanding humanity. And yet, despite all their efforts, the reports only led to more unsettling conclusions. A scientist stepped forward, her scaled fingers nervously tapping against her datapad. "Sir, we've analyzed every recorded battle, every strategic maneuver the humans have ever made. The results are concerning." Voktal narrowed his eyes. "Explain." She hesitated, then brought up a new series of reports. "We assumed humans were merely lucky, that their victories were accidents, or that their technology was secretly superior." She paused, but neither of those theories hold. Voktal leaned in, his tail twitching. "Then what is it?" The scientist swallowed. "It's them. Their nature." She glanced at the others in the room, as if afraid to speak the words out loud. Their adaptability, their unpredictability, their sheer refusal to accept defeat. She tapped her datapad, bringing up footage of human military campaigns. Even when outnumbered, even when on the brink of destruction, they find a way. The room was silent. The Xeric prided themselves on strategy, on calculated precision. But the humans, they fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. One of the intelligence officers growled, "This is unacceptable. There must be a weakness." The scientist shook her head. "We have yet to find one." Voktal exhaled slowly. "Then we continue looking." His claws tightened against the console. "Because if we don't, they will always be 2 steps ahead." On the HSS Valiant, John Carter sat in the command center, reviewing the stream of intelligence reports. Across from him, a human intelligence officer, Captain Reynolds, smirked as he placed a file on the table. "They took the bait," Reynolds said. Carter flipped through the report. Xeric espionage activity had spiked. Their spies were trying to learn everything they could about humanity, exactly as Carter had expected. He smirked. "Good. Let them dig." Lillian Carter entered the room, raising an eyebrow. "They think they're gathering intelligence, don't they?" Carter nodded. "And we're feeding them exactly what we want them to see." Lillian chuckled. "So while they study us," Carter's smirk widened, "we study them." The Xeric thought they were closing the gap, but in reality, every spy they sent, every bit of data they collected, was being carefully controlled. The humans weren't just countering their intelligence efforts, they were turning them into a weapon. Captain Reynolds leaned back. "They wanted to know what makes us dangerous." His grin was sharp. "They're about to find out." Carter's gaze drifted to the stars beyond the viewport. The Xeric believed they could understand humanity. But Carter knew the truth. They never would.